You're listening to Up an Octave, a podcast by Sonivia, the podcasting agency that believes that women and non-binary people deserve to take up space in the podcasting industry because our thoughts, voices, and stories matter. Here you'll learn how to make dope podcasts that inspire, educate, convert, and most importantly, make your voice shine. I'm your host, Rue Spence, and I'm here to take podcasting up an octave. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Up an Octave. Today I am passing the mic to Emily Aborn. Emily is absolutely a gem of a human being that I stumbled upon, and I am so happy for it. She is an amazing content copywriter for creative women entrepreneurs who hosts not one, but two podcasts. She hosts the She Built This podcast and the Content with Character podcast. We talked about her journey, how she supports other creative women, and more. This episode is truly special to me because I just really enjoyed connecting with her and getting to hear more about her motivations. All right, let's get into it. All right, Emily, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Rue. I'm so excited to bring people an octave up.
Oh, yes. So I was so excited to chat with you because you are a copywriting extraordinaire. And I'm super excited to hear how that dovetails into your show, Content with Character.
Yeah. Thank you for the kind words. I am a content copywriter, so I do copy for like websites and blogs and things like that, as well as like a little bit of the content strategy. So speaking to our podcast, what goes into our podcast and social media and things like that, because I see it as like this whole big, beautiful picture or pie, if you prefer yummy analogies.
I love it. At the time that we're recording this, we're just after American Thanksgiving, so I'm definitely still in the mood for pie. So how did you get started with that line of work? I mean, long before the podcast, because I know that kind of came later. What got you into a place where you knew that this is something that you were passionate about?
So the funny thing is, I think that I wanted to be a writer when I was a kid. Like, I should say this. I always was writing when I was a kid, like short stories and essays and all of those kinds of things. And when I also knew that I always wanted to be an entrepreneur. So, life takes us on all these twists and turns and unexpected journeys. I didn't go to school for any of that, naturally. I completely sidetracked and went to school for health education, nutrition, things like that. So I ended up working for like lots of chiropractors, lots of health organizations. And in 2014, my husband and I opened an organic mattress store, which it sounds weird. And people always looked at me like I had three heads, and rightfully so. It is a little odd, but there's a market for it around here. So we opened an organic mattress store, a retail shop. And in that, I was like the marketing person and the front facing. And so I did lots and lots of writing in my business. When we decided to transition out of that, I had to decide like what my next move was going to be. And basically, it was to the point where it's like, if you don't figure out what you're going to do, you have to go get a real job. And I was like, no, not a real job. So I started writing for people in my plaza, like just little tiny small businesses. I would do like their emails and their social media and their blogs. And I kind of just built my clientele until one day I woke up and I was like, oh, I think I have a copywriting business. And it has evolved a lot over time. So now I used to be very, very focused on social media. Now I'm very, very focused on website copy and how your website really can play a big, big role in your strategy. But it has just kind of evolved naturally. So then I sat down one day and I was like, if I look back and connect back to when I was a kid, I can see that this thread has actually been a part of my life like the entire time. And I just completely missed it.
That's funny because I kind of had the exact same experience with podcasting and audio engineering as well. I always loved podcasts, and I was like, yeah, it's the pandemic, I'm going to make one. Got really, really into the back end of stuff, and then started freelancing and kind of had that same, I think I'm doing this as a business moment. And then I started looking back and, realizing I always had a tape recorder in my hands. Like I was Kevin McAllister. Like I have always loved audio, and I don't know that I would have spoken that out loud because I don't think I knew that about myself. So it's kind of funny how we just find ourselves where we're supposed to be.
I totally agree. And same thing with the podcasting when I was a kid too. Like we used to record on the tape recorder, like little interviews and listen to audiobooks and all of those kinds of things. So I would venture to say we were the original podcasters, Rue.
I agree. Putting the tape over the little spools of the cassette so you could record over something. You remember that?
Yes.
Yeah, those were the good old days. All the, Gen Z folk listening are like,
What's a tape recorder?
You didn't just use your iPhone? Yeah. So then, how did podcasting come about for you?
So I actually, at one of the chiropractic offices that I worked at, well, actually, you know what? Kind of in high school, I did my senior project based on like a whole bunch of in-person interviews. And so I sort of fell in love with that style, like the interview and translating that into like a journalistic writing thing. For the chiropractor I worked with, I got to be her kind of sidekick on her podcast. It still is called For the Health of It. And I was basically just like the class clown on that podcast. Like I just brought nothing to the table except a sense of humor. But I got addicted from that moment on. And back in 2017, I went back to that same audio engineer where we had recorded those original podcasts. And he had run like a how to start a podcast course. I took it twice because I was like, one time is not enough. So I took it twice. And then I was like, I think I'm going to do this. I think I want to start. And I did actually start with him being my editor, my audio engineer. And for a very short stint, he was actually my co-host. So like if you go back to the very, very beginning of my podcast, he is my co-host. And like me, he also played class clown.
I actually really love that format of a show because I think especially when you are in a very like niche that requires some level of knowledge, it's so helpful to have a class clown or like a lay person who's like, hold on, you sound way too much like a doctor right now. I'm going to pretend that I'm the listener going, what the heck are you even talking about?
Exactly that. Like we basically just had fun playing stupid.
I love that so much. So that was your first show.
Yes. So that was She Built This. And so I officially launched that. Although I want to point something out. I didn't actually really launch anything. I just kind of recorded a bunch of episodes and then I was like, hey, everyone, I have a podcast. Like I didn't know what I didn't know. And I just knew that I wanted a podcast. So I started that in New Hampshire, interviewing just New Hampshire women. And then I started to see it as like a really good collaboration tool and networking tool and just a way to like feed my own curiosity around things. So then I started expanding that to basically anywhere in the world with a guest that I wanted to have on my show.
I love that so much because I talk so much about that the best podcasting really does come from like a curious space. Because I think when you are genuinely interested in learning something, that's where the best content comes from.
I so agree. And I didn't know what I didn't know, but I started with like the same questions for every guest. Like I just had a list of like 10 questions and I would just go through them very robotically. My responses were always like, oh, I love that. And then I would just move on to the next question. So I've learned, I think curiosity is a muscle and we can build it and grow it. And I think that one way to do that is podcasting because you're just basically having fascinating conversations with people.
Definitely. No, I really like the muscle analogy because I feel like too often we box ourselves in. And I hear this especially with people who are curious about starting a podcast. And they're like, well, I just couldn't because. And I'm like, yeah, well, I can't lift a 100-pound barbell today either. But
right.
If I tried and I practiced and I got a little better each time, eventually I probably could. And I feel like it's very much the same with interviewing or podcasting or honestly, most things in life.
You should expect yourself to be messy and mess up at the beginning and know that it's not going to be perfect. Like that's a kind of unrealistic expectation that we put on ourselves to like hop on the balance beam and it be like a perfect 10 the very first time that we do it, right? It takes a lot of falling off and a lot of messing up and a lot of not perfect 10s to get even remotely good. Never mind. I mean, we're not even going for perfect here, but it totally is a skill that you have to keep on building.
Yeah, definitely. And I think so often too for like creative things, there is, if you're anything like me, there's kind of that, well, I wasn't perfect at it right away, so I'm just going to stop. Because like in your head, you see like, oh, I could just probably like figure out how to read a pattern and make a beautiful designer gown like tomorrow. That sometimes I think it's really hard to push through that awkward, not knowing, learning phase.
I have a friend, Terry Trespicio. She's been a guest on my podcast, and she talks about how talent is a little bit overrated. But I think as we learn this kind of as kids, like if you're a natural prodigy, right, you can just get out there and you're like amazing at soccer, basketball. And she talks about how like talent may have worked when you were a child, but it isn't really what's going to serve you in the long run. Like it is about actually learning and growing and taking time with your craft. And I always remember that because I think we can easily get caught into that trap where we just expect ourselves to be completely talented at every single thing that we pick up. And that's just not the way it works.
Gifted kid burnout syndrome, 100%.
Gifted kid burnout syndrome. Yes, I walked away from every sport I ever tried when I started to not be good at it anymore.
Yep. No, that you're singing my song. So how was it different launching content with character after your experience with She Built This? What did you do differently? What did you learn that you're like, that didn't work so well. I want to try this a little differently since I have a chance to start over.
So I think it also will be helpful for me to share why I decided to do that, because you on paper, it was like, well, you already have a podcast. Why would you start another podcast? So on the She Built This podcast, I shared that I mostly interviewed women entrepreneurs, and I was trying to interlace some solo episodes that were like focused on me and my business. But I will say this, it did not feel 100% aligned. Like that's just not, that actually wasn't the mission and vision of She Built This. And I never really wanted those businesses to kind of merge together. They were always two little separate entities, my copywriting business and that. And She Built This also included a community piece for quite a while. And so that sort of fed into the whole podcasting thing as well. So one day I did a podcast audit actually with one of my friends. And she was kind of showing me which of the episodes were most listened to. And we were talking about what I could do for changes. And she's like, I really think you either need to rebrand this and make it like specific to the kind of clients that you want to be working with and sharing your knowledge and expertise, or B, start another one. And when she said that, I was like, start another podcast? No way. Like, are you crazy? But I let the idea sit, and it simmered for a while, and then suddenly I could not stop generating ideas for myself. Like I mean, to this day, I think I have 100 episodes that I'm like, I could talk about this. I could talk about this. I could talk about this. So like the ideas just started coming and did not stop. And I didn't want to rebrand She Built This because I wanted, like I said, I wanted to use that for my like sort of collaboration piece. So launching it looked different in that I actually kind of knew that you have to do something to launch a podcast. Like you can't just, it's not a crock pot. You can't just set it and forget it and hope that like dinner will be ready at the end of the day. So I kind of got together like a group of people. Like I asked 10 people to help me out on the day that I was going to launch it. So I put I put episode 0 in the kitty. And I had that like ready to go because you have to kind of let it sit for I think it's a week actually for Apple to really like recognize that it's a thing. And then it was important to me to launch on my birthday. So I launched it officially on my birthday. And that resulted in me getting like tons and tons of social media shout outs and people sharing my podcast on my birthday. So you can imagine like that felt really, really good. Yeah. So I just kind of gathered those 10 people and also asked. At that time, I really did include in every episode. And for those 10 people, I asked them to write me an Apple review. So I do have, like, I am working on getting a large amount of Apple reviews in as a ratio to how many episodes I've actually released.
That is such a brilliant strategy. And I launched this show on my birthday. So I'm like, oh, yep, twinning.
Oh my gosh, we are.
Yeah, for real. But no, I love that. And I think that so often it's hard to remember like your organic connections, especially if like self-promotion is uncomfortable for you, if you're not used to being like the girl in the spotlight kind of person, that to be like, hey, can you listen to my podcast can be uncomfortable. But it's something that I think is so valuable because those are already people who love you. And even if they don't get it, even if they're not entrepreneurs who maybe super duper care about copywriting or thinking in that entrepreneurial place, or like in my case, if they don't super care about podcasting, they still care about you. They still want to support you in whatever your endeavor is.
I want to share another thing when you said that about people loving you and wanting to support you. It reminded me of another piece of actually launching, which did come with a little bit of fear. I did not want anyone to say, what business does she have having 2 podcasts? oh, now she's just doing a solo show and it's just going to be like the her show, right? And I definitely kept the secret longer than I probably should have. So I just kept kind of teasing people along and saying, I have a secret coming, or I have a secret, something's coming, yada, yada, yada. There were some people in my life, like my mom and my dad, who helped with like deciding on the podcast art. There were a couple of close people that knew what I was up to, in addition to those 10 people, but I did hold it very close to my chest. In retrospect, the amount of support that I got when I actually launched it was so great that I'm like, why did I not like lead up to the launch a little bit stronger? You know, like really proclaim that this is what I was going to be doing. And so for the person listening who is about to go through a launch or will be facing one in the near future, I would really encourage you to make some noise about it, like before you're even ready to go, and include people on things like, what podcast art am I choosing? What intro music should I choose? And that was something I had done with She Built This, and I didn't do it for myself because, like you had said, like when it's time for me to step into the spotlight, I'm like, oh, no, that is too bright. That spotlight is too bright for me. Let's pull someone else in.
The fear is like so the hardest element. And it's kind of, I'm sure that we're entering like a very psychological space, because I think so much of it is like that more intimate fear of like the people who you know and whose opinions matter more. Like I have no problem putting my show out to everybody who is interested in listening. But then when my husband's like, yeah, I'm listening to your show today, I'm like, oh God, oh no, I'm dying. Don't listen.
I'll tell my husband like, okay, you can listen to today's, or I mentioned you in today's episode, meaning it's okay to listen. But I think he does listen regardless, but I know what you mean. Like, it's like the people closest to us that we really care about what they think and what, not that we don't care about what other people think, but I think that it stings less if for some reason it doesn't land.
It impacts you more directly. You know, if you ruffle feathers that you then have to see these people at Christmas, that hits a little bit different than some stranger on the internet who you've never even seen their face saying, oh, I hate this.
Yeah. And also, why would they? I mean, we're not,
right.
I'm not like saving lives on my podcast here or providing controversial information. So again, it's like just looking at what those fears are and where they come from, I think.
Absolutely. So the question that I'm sure is like the most hot button that people are going to be so curious to hear about is, how does copywriting inform the way that you handle your podcast, especially in the promotion sphere?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I guess for my actual copywriting business, I am constantly, and I want to encourage people to do this too, because we can easily get away from this if you're not cognizant of it. But I'm always reminding people of who I am and what I do and how I help, because in my first podcast, I never did that. And as a result, guess what? Nobody ever knew what I did because they were like, I never told them. So I would first say constantly reminding people of who you are, what you do, and how you help. Secondly, I'm a big believer in less is more when it comes to your overall like content strategy. And I believe that whether you're guesting or whether you're creating a podcast of your own, solo or with a guest, you typically can take that podcast and turn it into multiple pieces of content. So for me, one podcast will end up being likely a blog, an email, multiple social media posts. Like I pretty much never have to do anything except for that podcast. And that is something I'm working on even more in the new year in 2024, because I really like, we can run ourselves around in circles being like, what should I post? What should I post? It has to be original, it has to be new, when so much of the content is right here in our conversation, in our podcast itself.
That's so true, especially because, I mean, people are like constantly like, oh, I'm fighting with the algorithm, or I don't know what to talk about, or I don't want to be, camera facing. You really nailed it, that your podcast kind of is the engine that should power the rest of your strategy.
And I also think we think that everybody is reading our posts. We think everybody's reading our email. We think everybody's listening to our podcast and watching our video. And most of the time, people are not following you in all the places, and they're definitely not consuming all your content. And even if they were, it's so good for people to hear things like repetitively. And I like to think of it as like cohesion, not repetition, right? Like I'm being cohesive, not repetitive, or I'm being clear and delivering a consistent message to kind of get that out of my head. Because I'm like, well, I've already said this. I just said it in my podcast. So I think that the more ways we can share our content with people, the better. And your podcast is such a great tool for that because like I said, like it is literally an entire conversation's worth of podcast, which is post after post after post after post. I do a lot of outlining and putting bullet points under my outline. And sometimes if I am really certain I want to say something in a certain way, I'll write it out exactly how I want to say it. So this saves me time on the back end if I want to repost about that same exact thing or turn it into a blog. But for most people, if you're not like doing an outline, for most people, an Otter AI transcript or something like that is super, super helpful. You can literally just go through, pick out the pieces, the points, and turn them into something new.
Definitely a great tip about the AI for transcripts. I recently had an episode about how I use AI for my podcast, and I think transcription is one of the biggest no-brainers for how to integrate those kind of done-for-you services. That's such a good tip. And then also, I think that, well, again, we're just kind of cut from the same cloth because that's really my strategy for how I outline my episodes as well. But I think that so often we kind of forget that those outlines exist after we record. I find that that's where so many of those ideas come from, is if you just glance back through your outline, you're like, oh yeah, I should just make a social media post about this. That then you're not trying to like listen back through and you're like, oh, hold on, I want to pull this. Like if you start with that outline, it's already done for you essentially.
Yeah, your outline, or if you are doing an interview style podcast, the questions you ask, those are all like right there, ready to go show notes. You know, like you really shouldn't have to do too much, except obviously clean it up grammatically to use that again. And then from there, like you said, like, and you can do this with guest interviews too. Like every question somebody asks you on their podcast is something that you can reuse as a piece of your own content. And bonus points if you tag the person that asked you the question and bring them in as a collaborative, like as you know, you're opening up a collaborative conversation.
No, definitely. So how do you think that people who are not coming from necessarily a, background where they love to write or have an interest in copywriting per se, but they do find themselves in this podcasting space, what tips do you have for that person?
Well, I would say you're probably in more luck than I am because I don't think that everybody loves to read, but I think that a lot of people love to watch video and reels. So if you can include a video component of your podcast, even if it's just like a short little clip, I think that that is a really, really popular way to reuse your content. And I'm trying to think of like something else would maybe be turning it into, let's say, an audio course. So edit your podcast is like a little sample of a topic, and then it leads people into going deeper. Poor Rue. I'm like, here's more work for you to edit and do for your clients. But I have seen that also be a strategy. So if writing is really not your thing, you can always direct people to video content or to course content, or you can just record your video while you're doing your actual episode and turn it into a YouTube channel. Now, I don't know much about YouTube, and I do know that it comes with like a SEO strategy all of its own and a content strategy all of its own. But I have also seen a lot of people do that. And I have a friend who she said like 50% of her audience watches it on YouTube. And I'm like, why? Why would you ever do that? But for some people, that is really how they consume it.
Yeah, especially with the YouTube RSS feed integration that's just been rolled out. That's pretty exciting stuff to me. I'm excited to see how it's going to continue to shift metrics as they kind of iron out some of the kinks.
Yeah, so you know more than me. I'm just like, sometimes I watch YouTube. That's all I got. That is all I got for experience.
Just to pivot a little bit back into your actual production, you sound great. What microphone are you using?
So I have a Samsung Q2U, and you know why I like it? It's not like the highest end microphone. I think it's $100, but I like it because I am clumsy and I drop things, including microphones and expensive things. And so I like the opportunity to be able to replace it and not feel like I just dropped a $400, $300 microphone.
I'm a big fan of that microphone. I've heard several people who use it and they all sound pretty good, even if they have very different voices. So I'm definitely a big fan of that one. Was that the one that you started with?
Yes. And then I dropped it.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, I need to replace this. So then I'm like, I'm going to keep on using this one.
That's kind of why I use the Audio Technica for headphones. And I feel like they are the OtterBox of headphones because I have a currently 15-month-old and she puts everything through the ringer. I'm not going to throw her totally under the bus because I've also dropped them and yanked them by the cord and done terrible things. And they're survivors. So I'm glad that the Samson is holding up for you.
Yes.
And then, so you mentioned that when you started your first show, you had an audio engineer working with you, editing, and at one point co-hosting. Who's on your team right now?
I actually, because it's just a solo episode, I just do my own. With the She Built This podcast, I probably should have had somebody help me, but now I am to the point where I have interviews that, let's just say they need very little editing at this point with how judicious I am with my guests.
With that said, what is your workflow like for editing? Because I know a lot of people are really intimidated by editing. I know you mentioned earlier Otter for AI. Are you using any kind of AI editing or did you just teach yourself to edit? What's that look like for you?
Oh, I just saw someone recommend something, Descript, I think, and I really wanted, so that's on my radar to try. But currently, and don't judge, please, I have a Mac, and so I use GarageBand. That's actually, it's not what I learned on. I learned on Audacity, but it's a very similar interface. So I use GarageBand, and basically, when I'm doing my solos, I just hit record and go. And then if I have to stop and re-say something, I backtrack. With my other one, I just upload it. I prefer to upload it immediately after our conversation because I know where the spots are. Like if anything happened that I want to cut out, I know exactly where those spots are. And I like to set up my intro while it's fresh in my mind. And if I don't do that for some reason, for me, I lose a little bit of the energy after. And I'm just like, what did we talk about again? So that's mine. Very, very simple. I mean, I think it used to be very, very complicated, and I have simplified it majorly. When I do have a guest, I send them a follow-up email letting them know when their episode is going to go live. And then a day before their episode goes live, I send them another follow-up email. This is all like automated. I send them another follow-up email with all the assets and links and things like that, letting them know exactly how to share it and exactly what I would love for them to say and to put into their own words if they want to.
That's brilliant. And definitely no judgment here. I am an Audacity girly through and through. That's what I use. That's what I teach. So I find GarageBand to be pretty congruent with Audacity's features. And like you mentioned, it's integrated on your Mac already and it's free. So I see no reason why people shouldn't be using what they already have.
Okay, thank you. Good. I feel better.
Definitely. You have my blessing. I love that you mention kind of striking while the iron's hot, because I do find that kind of contributes to pod fade, or when people just kind of stop posting, is that you kind of lose that spark. You lose that momentum. So how often are you recording?
Okay, so for She Built This, I've actually gone down to what I call an infrequent consistency. So I just do that once a month, which means I only have to record with somebody once a month. For my own show, I do a weekly show. Right now, I'm actually like ahead of the game. So I'll probably do another recording this week, which means I would have done 2 this week. But typically, I'm like sitting here on a Saturday afternoon recording my show, which goes out on Tuesday. So I'm really trying to like get ahead, because I do think that you can be excited about what you're talking about in 2 weeks and it can still be fresh on your mind, but I don't want to push it out so far ahead. Like I have friends that are like 5 months out on their episodes, and I'm like, how do you even get excited about it when you share it?
There's definitely a balance, I find. And I think that part of it is having that kind of social media strategy in place so that you're not then however many months later going, hold on, what was that even about? That if you can kind of just generate a folder that lives on your computer that's like, that's what this episode is, I think that's so helpful, as opposed to just kind of letting episodes just kind of sit and stagnate. Because it's hard to kind of get fired up again when it has been a while.
I think that it also probably is really dependent on like someone's style. So like I'm a planner and I know what I'm going to talk about for the next, I don't know, 2 months. But I do, as a planner, I also lose energy as things start to come at me, if that makes any sense at all. So like when dates are looming, I'm like, oh boy, now I'm not excited about it anymore. It's just like an anxiety thing. So you have to kind of know where you stand in that and use that to your advantage rather than like use it to your detriment. So like, yeah, exactly what we're saying.
That makes a lot of sense. So as we kind of start to wrap up, what advice do you have for people who are maybe kind of on the fence or starting to think about podcasting? What little hug would you give them through the airwaves?
Okay, so I'm going to give them a little baby step to take, and that is twofold. First of all, I would say to be a guest on somebody else's podcast. And like to start doing that, kind of think about 3 things that you really, really want to be known for and pitch to be a guest on somebody's podcast using those 3 things. So that's step 1, because what that's going to teach you is, do I actually even like this format before you get into it? It's also going to build those conversational skills and muscles and curiosity muscles. And it also will show you, do I actually like turning this into other pieces of content? So like you've answered 3 questions for yourself right off the bat. And then I would really say, challenge yourself to sit down. I don't know if you want to do it in a day or a week or however your brain works. Challenge yourself to sit down and come up with 15 to 20 episodes that you like know you could talk about almost in your sleep. You're like, all right, these are 15 to 20 things that I do in my business or in my life that I feel really, really excited to talk about. I say this because if you struggle to come up with 15 to 20 things that you really are excited to share with, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to keep on coming up with ideas after those 15 to 20 things. And I'm sure you've seen this, Rue. You sometimes see people who want to start a podcast, but then they get stuck because they can't come up with and generate more ideas. So that's kind of a way to like, I also think it starts to build the excitement. It's like, ooh, yeah, I can do this. I do have ideas. I do want to talk about this. I do want to talk about that. So that's my advice. I think it's a really, really good place to start. And I would definitely recommend guesting because you will learn very quickly about whether or not you even like having a microphone in front of you.
You can't see me because we're audio only, but I am like bobblehead mode right now. I'm just like enthusiastically, yes, 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 yes. That's all spot on advice. And then so to become a guest, which I mean, we connected on a Facebook group, but I think this is maybe somewhere that your copywriting expertise comes into play. What's an interesting way that people can start their pitch?
So I like to take normal topics. So I'll give you an example. One of my topics is building curiosity into your content. So basically, the principle is probably things that a lot of other copywriters, a lot of other content writers have talked about, but I kind of gave it my own title and my own spin. So let's say you are a life coach and you're talking about boundaries. Okay. That's like if you just pitch to be on a podcast and you're like, I want to talk about boundaries. They've heard it before and they've also probably been pitched in that way before. So how can you put your unique spin on it? Like, are there 4 different types of boundaries? Are there creating boundaries for your emotional, physical, mental, business life? You know, like how can you put your own unique spin on it and make it a little bit different? And then bonus points if you can like turn it into a catchy title, which don't get too clever. But I do think that like some sort of like I like to make it really easy for people to be able to title the episode in an interesting way, if that makes sense. So think about the title of your actual episode. Like what will cause people to lean in and be like, oh, I need to know more about that. A great example of somebody, she's a life coach. And I did want to have her on my podcast. And her topic is, and I will have her on my podcast, and her topic is 4 different types of perfectionism. Now, you can see how much more interesting that is to me as a podcast host versus just, I want to talk about perfectionism. It's like, yeah, who doesn't? But 4 different types of perfectionism gives me, the host, like this super easy title, like, what type of perfectionist are you? And I just say, the more you can do the legwork for the host, the more it shows you're just a fantastic collaborator from start to finish.
That's brilliant. The thing that I'll add is that podcasters are very busy and very tired. And so finding people who are able to meet them halfway and contribute that value in addition to the interview, that's such a strong point.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is just think of how many pitches they're getting and just deleting if it doesn't catch their eye. And I mean that in the kindest of ways because I don't want to discourage people, but I do think it's important to recognize that that's happening.
That's very, very true. It's especially in, the online space. It's so easy to pitch nowadays. You don't have to go to the building and ask for the interview. You just slide into someone's DMs and say, hey, I do a thing. I'd like to show you me doing that thing. That it kind of becomes a little monotonous at times. So definitely if you can find a way to position yourself uniquely, I think that's huge.
I know we need to wrap up and I want to give one more tip on the pitching front, if that's okay.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. The other thing I found really, really beneficial is, well, first of all, we're in a great group. We're in the podcast collaboration group, and that is a wonderful resource and it's free at the base level. But in addition to that, like I have my little podcast crew in there and we all cheer each other on when we see each other in the comments. So the podcast the podcast community is a very small, loving bunch. And once you get on one podcast and you do a great job, people tend to pass your name along and say, oh, you need to be a guest on so-and-so show. And that just keeps on going.
It feels really big until you're in it. And then it's like, oh, hey, fancy seeing you here.
Exactly. And I can't even tell you how many times I've just heard somebody on a friend's podcast and I'm like, oh, I need that guest too. Like a no-brainer. So that's how it works. So like that, I say that to encourage people to just get started.
Fabulous. So I'm obviously going to include information in the show notes, but hype yourself up. Where can people find you? How can they share? How can they listen to you? Where are you on the internet?
Thank you so much for that opportunity. So since you're already listening to a great podcast, and it's clear that you like to learn, I would say come on over and join me on the Content with Character podcast that comes out weekly on Tuesdays. And you can find it on any podcast app you listen to. And my website, which has if you like social media and you want to be friends on social media, we can do that. My website is emilyaborn.com. And that links to every place that you could possibly imagine.
Fabulous. Well, Emily, thank you so much for coming on today and helping me take podcasting up an octave.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I'll be back next week to talk about how different microphones sound on your voice. I'll be giving you the skinny on all the microphones that I've used over the years and the ones that I recommend to this day. So you're going to want to make sure you tune into that one. In the meantime, you can head over to Instagram where the party keeps going and I share more podcasting tips and tricks at Sonivia Studios. You can write in a question for me to answer on the show and shout out your podcast at rue.sonivia@gmail.com. Please follow or subscribe to this show wherever you're listening to it. And if you're feeling super generous, leave me a rating or a review because just like your show, mine needs those to grow. Until next time, thanks for helping me take podcasting up an octave.